Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's educational webinar, 5 Essentials for Patient Privacy Program Success. My name is Estelle Turnus, and I will be your moderator and technical assistant today. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, you can email me at estelle.turnus@iatric.com. You can see that on your screen. Or you can look for my email address in the questions section of your control panel. This webinar is being recorded for quality purposes. If you do have questions, please submit them using the questions section of the control panel. And you can submit your questions in the questions section of your control panel at any time during the webinar. When we break for Q&A, I'll go ahead and read those questions out loud to our presenter at that time. And finally, after the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to fill out a short survey to tell us how we did. The survey will appear when you leave the webinar. For your time, your name will be entered into a drawing to win a $100 Amazon gift card, and all drawings are held at the end of each month. And I believe that's all the housekeeping items we have. So now I'd like to formally introduce Tim Burris, our presenter. Tim is the Product Manager for Security Audit Manager here at iatric Systems. He is an ISC2 certified healthcare information security and privacy practitioner, and he has managed patient privacy implementations at many hospitals and healthcare systems across the nation. Tim gained much of his privacy and security background while serving in the U.S. Air Force and while working for Houston Healthcare in Warner Robins, Georgia. And now I'll turn it over to Tim to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Estelle. So today we're going to be talking about a process called the privacy cycle. The privacy cycle is that continuous process that ties an organization's regulatory requirements to meaningful actions in the organization with a goal of improving patient privacy culture. So it's basically taking what the regulations say we have to do and implementing that in a meaningful way, not just a way that fills check boxes, but a way that improves our culture. So it's really trying to get to the deeper meaning behind those regulatory requirements to make positive changes in our organizations. This process is broken down into 5 key steps, and we're going to touch on each of these steps today during our presentation. It's going to begin with policies and procedures, move through auditing, documentation, trend analysis, and then finally administering the appropriate corrective action. And this is a cycle, so it doesn't stop there. It's something that will rinse and repeat. So let's go ahead and dive right in and talk about our first step, which is a policy and procedure review. Policies and procedures typically are born out of regulatory requirements or a need for your organization. If we look at those regulatory requirements that go into patient privacy, some that stand out to me as a patient privacy auditor are those that are outlined in the HIPAA security rule. They say that organizations should implement policies to detect security violations. Organizations should have mechanisms to record and examine activity, and organizations should implement procedure to regularly review records. So if you look at just that underlined and italicized text, the HIPAA security rule is starting to emphasize here the need that we should be able to detect recorded information. We should be able to detect inappropriate activity by looking at recorded information, and we should regularly review that. So out of these requirements, we might build some policies and procedures related to recording and examining activity and regularly reviewing it. OCR's provided some guidance in response to this as well. They say it's imperative for both covered entities and business associates to review their audit trails regularly. This puts it in a much better language. OCR took away some of that legal ease and just said you need to review audit trails regularly, both particularly after incidents or breaches and during real-time operations. This says it's not just an investigative response, but it's also something that you should do on a day-to-day basis. And we need regular review of information system activity to promote awareness of system activity that could suggest a security incident or breach. So it's basically OCR is telling us that we shouldn't just wait for the breach to land in our lap, or we shouldn't wait for them to notify us we should be actively looking for these things. We should be actively monitoring the data to find them as they occur. So now we need to take this guidance and these regulatory requirements, and we need to write it into an actionable policy or procedure. And there's some considerations that I would recommend that you make when doing so. One is to determine, and I have in quotes here, the reasonable and appropriate measures to implement. And when we're talking about that reasonable and appropriate measures, it's born out of the next two bullet points, which one of them is a risk assessment. We want to conduct a risk assessment that tells us what are areas in our organization that are at risk. Is there a particular system? Is there a particular process? Is there a particular set of employees that constitute an additional risk or work area? So when we have an area that constitutes an additional risk, we're going to look at considerations like our technical infrastructure, what software and resources we have available to us, what staffing and expertise we have available to us, and we're going to build a policy and a procedure that we can actually accomplish. If you have a great idea for a policy or procedure, but you just don't truly have the technology to adhere to it, that procedure is probably not something that you should put on paper to permanently have to follow that guideline without having the capability to follow through. So then let's tie this back to our first point. It has to be reasonable and appropriate. And this gives you wiggle room. Reasonable and appropriate is verbiage that is outlined in the HIPAA guidance and in OCR guidance that gives your organization an out. And not a full out, but it's giving you flexibility to implement the measures appropriate to your organization. So what it's saying is that the policy written for a large multi-tenant organization might be different than a policy written for a physician-owned practice. These different sizes and scopes are going to create a lot of unique scenarios in terms of capability, in terms of risk, and those things need to be factored in when we're writing these policies. When we do write these policies, they should be effective and enforceable. So we're not just pencil whipping these things. We're not just writing down policies to fill a checkbox. We want policies that really do give us something that's going to make a positive change in our organization and that we can enforce. We want to look back on these policies regularly. So we want a process built into our procedures to routinely review our own practices. And then the goal of all of this, remember, is to promote culture. So just winding back to talk about that whole process, you're going to have a regulatory requirement or you're going to have guidance from a regulatory body. Now, I've used auditing as an example here, but this policy and procedure review can go to any privacy-related regulatory requirements. There are certainly physical requirements. There are certainly administrative and technical safeguards. So there are a number of safeguards to consider. In this example, we're using auditing, the auditing guidance that was provided. And we're going to look at that. We're going to build out of those regulatory requirements effective and enforceable policies and procedures. Now, we're going to move into our step. Now, here I've done step 2 as auditing. It could be, but what it really means is putting the policy into practice. Because I set an example of auditing, we're going to look at auditing as a way of putting that into practice. We're going to adhere to those policies and procedures. So in this case, when we're doing this auditing, we're complying with that regulatory requirement. That risk assessment, again, becomes important. That risk assessment tells us what systems need to be routinely audited, what systems are within scope, what's their overall risk, and what audit tools and features do we have available. Of course, follow the Pareto principle here. Put 80% of your effort on, or put 20% of your effort to accomplish 80% of your work. You want to definitely work smarter when it comes to following your policies and procedures. Put your effort where it's going to gain you the most results. Use that Pareto principle. And then you use the additional time to get into those harder nooks and crannies. So when you're looking at that, use the features that you have available, what is reasonable and appropriate for your organization. Know your users. Now, when we're talking about auditing specifically, you're usually reviewing the performance of individuals within your systems. Who is this? Do we know who is using these systems? Now, it's easy as a healthcare organization to say, well, of course we know who's using these systems. They are our employees. Well, sometimes their access is granted to a wider scope than some organizations realize. Consider non-employees, physicians, contractors, students, vendors. Who has access to your data? If you start to really look at the big picture, you might have a vendor who provides support to your organization. You might have information that's being shared to the government for research purposes. You might have a number of departments. There are a lot of hands in the pot. So who is accessing these systems? And do we have details on all of those individuals? Do we know about those who's? If you have a vendor who's providing you support, if you have an employee in your organization or non-employees and physicians, students, contractors, do we really know who they are? Do we have any demographics on those individuals? And have we documented what each user should have access to? This just goes to good best practices. When we want to audit, we need to compare data. We need to look at what's normal behavior to find out what is abnormal. So this is where documenting what a user should be doing and what a user should have access to, this is where that process can be helpful. Building role templates, building access management protocols and things like that. So let's talk about the auditing program as a whole. We know we have to audit people, and those people are going to be everyone in our organization, from students to physicians. But who's responsible for it? Who's going to actually do the auditing? What are the scope of those audits? How much time? How much digging are they going to do? How far are they going to go when they find something that looks suspicious to validate it? How often? What is the frequency of this audit? What's the cycle? Is it something you're going to do weekly or bi-weekly? And if you do find something, or if the responsible individual finds something, what are they going to do about it? What's the process to investigate that, to escalate that, to follow up on that later? All of this is a part of that auditing program. So it gets, sometimes when you're building the program, it goes beyond the requirement itself. When we go back, tie back to our step 1 regulations, it said we have to implement this auditing program. We have to regularly review this access. But now we're seeing a lot more goes into that. As we start to actually put the rubber to the road and we perform this auditing, our procedures are growing. So those policies and procedures are expanding as we really start to look at the scope of what we want to do. A good example of a basic auditing program, and remember that this could be any privacy-related program, is a weekly program. You're going to do weekly proactive auditing. You're going to have procedures laid down for investigation of complaints, and we're going to be able to investigate issues related to known security incidents. So if there was a incident where a password was compromised, can you investigate that to see if it resulted in a breach? So this is a very, very simplified example, but it sets a foundation for us being able to get started on building the foundations of an audit program. When we're doing our auditing, we're actually conducting that auditing. Remember that I noted that we need to compare a normal activity to abnormal activity. Abnormal activity can also be identified by looking at things like known relationships between the user and patient. If we say that it would be abnormal for an employee to go into the record of a neighbor, a coworker, a relative, or a roommate, these sorts of things could signify indicators of inappropriate activity. These are indicators of a breach of privacy. So this is things we might look for when looking at the scope of our auditing program. We might look at the volume of record accessed. So how many audit logs are being generated from user to user? What are the number of unique patients being accessed by each user? And we can maybe even establish some norms or some baselines that we can compare their activity to, so that if they have a higher volume of activity, that will stand out. And we can look at irregular behaviors. This is somewhere that I spent a lot of my time as an auditor, was looking at when a user goes into a part of your medical record system that is not really appropriate for their job. Let's say that we have an employee who works in your ICU, an ICU nurse, and the ICU nurse is going into billing and coding documentation. They're looking at billing and coding info. In the ICU, they'll typically need vital signs, they'll need orders, they'll need meds, they'll need patient clinical summaries and histories, but billing and registration information, that starts to get suspicious. If we had a registrar, on the other side of that, if you had somebody who's a registrar or from your billing department going into the orders of a patient or clinical notes, that could look confusing as well. So when you have a role of an individual, now let's just step back a couple of slides. We talked about, when we talked about knowing your user, having a documentation of what each user or role should have access to, this is where it's important. Because if a registrar should have access to just registration type information, when they go into that billing information or clinical orders or notes, then it really starts to stand out as abnormal. So this is what we're actually looking for when we're auditing, is these abnormalities. A comprehensive audit solution can save your organization a lot of time by consolidating those systems. So if you have a number of EMR systems that you have to audit, a number of systems that are within scope, an audit solution brings that data together for you. And there are a lot of great solutions out there. So I definitely recommend that you investigate the solutions that are available to make adhering to those policies and procedures more effective. I want to go ahead and pause here before we start to move into our next few steps of the privacy cycle and open it up for any questions. We'll take a few minutes of questions and we'll talk about how this process begins to tie together and how we're going to learn from what we've audited. Estelle, have we received any questions yet?
Thanks, Tim. Before I say the questions, I'm just going to remind everybody that if you do have a question, please enter it into the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And the only question we've gotten so far is, will we get this PowerPoint? And the answer to that is yes. And actually, we'll send the PowerPoint and a link to the recorded session. We've gotten another question, Tim. Who is typically responsible for performing audits?
In organizations, that really depends on your organization's size and scope. So bigger organizations are more likely to be able to dedicate a resource. Nothing's better than a dedicated resource or a dedicated team, somebody who has a background in auditing who can do your auditing. But as organizations get smaller and budgets get leaner, you of course have to do more with less. So those resources might have to be people with dual roles. If you have a privacy or compliance officer, those could be individuals who assist with auditing. I've seen this actually go into an IT role and IT security. And the IT security team is good at auditing things like firewall logs and access intrusion and detection and prevention. And so they have some experience in auditing, so they leverage that experience when it comes to auditing EMR access as well. But it's really up to you to make that determination as an organization. How much do you have in terms of resources, and what's your level of risk? Because risk, of course, that can really justify getting some additional resources, because breaches, as we know, are very expensive. So that could be enough to justify getting a dedicated individual into an auditing role in your organization. So maybe somebody who wears multiple hats. It may be a dedicated auditor, depending on what resources you have available. Any other questions, Estelle?
So Tim, I know you have a lot more to cover. Let's go ahead and continue, and then we'll have another open Q&A session at the end of the webinar.
Certainly. All right, so we have looked at regulatory requirements, and based out of those requirements, it says we were supposed to audit. So we built an auditing program, and we did it. We actually audited access. And as a result of that auditing, we found things. We actually found inappropriate activity in our organization. Now it's time to formally document those findings. So when it comes to documentation, there's a lot of types of documentation that we need to do, and this is all pertaining to our auditing example. It could be incident documentation, and an incident is every investigated incident. This could include even investigations that didn't result in an inappropriate event. Maybe you found an indicator, something looks suspicious. John Doe went into a large volume of records, and I just want to take a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and document that. I'm going to document that I'm spending my time to look at this. This is what I found as an indicator, and I'm just going to document that I'm doing an investigation. Now, that may or may not bear fruit. I may find out that John's access was legitimate and appropriate, and I may find out that John actually was doing something he's not supposed to. But in either case, it's good to at least put some basic documentation to provide details of that investigation, because I can look back on that later. It becomes a helpful benchmark, and we'll talk about that here shortly. There's also things like a breach risk assessment, and we'll talk about that risk assessment in just a second. I'm going to jump down to breach documentation. So if a breach occurs, we definitely need to document that breach. There is some great guidelines provided by Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Health and Human Services about what specifically needs to be documented in the event of a breach. So definitely make sure that you reference those OCR and HHS guidelines and you get the required breach documentation items. And if you have ever actually submitted a breach report to OCR, those are things like what was the type of breach, what was the type of information contained in the breach, and so on. But how do we know if an incident that occurred was actually a reportable breach? That's where the risk assessment comes into play. We need to, at some point, determine, is this incident a breach? And that's not just a decision. It's actually the result of a risk assessment, a breach risk assessment. Now, you're at the end of it, you're going to make a decision, but if you get audited by the Office of Civil Rights or you get audited by a vendor at the direction of the OCR, you need to be able to provide how those decisions were made. So we need to document what decision support told me that this was a breach. So it's really important. Documentation is not only a really good way to provide accountability in the event of an audit, but provide record keeping, but if you have that OCR organization come in, it proves compliance. It's a really good compliance tool. Now, down at the very bottom, the documentation of the breach notification actions is if it's a breach, we're required to notify the affected individual. We may have to notify the media. We may have to notify our state, depending on different state requirements. So we definitely want to document if, when, and where those notification actions occurred. Have good record-keeping processes. So let's also think about when we're documenting incidents, what is the information that could benefit a later review? So when we look back on these incidents and we're looking at their raw facts, what else is going to help us learn and grow? One thing I like to think of is how the incident was identified. This is a great little record-keeping measure to tell us how many incidents did we find proactively? How many incidents were reported to us by a patient or by a family member? How many incidents were prompted as a result of a security incident? All of these identify how we found it is going to tell us about our program. It's going to tell us, okay, we have an effective proactive program, or hey, we're not catching a lot of these things up front. Maybe we need to do more active auditing, or maybe we need to get more word out. So how the incident was identified kind of tells you how many of these you're catching on your own versus how many are reported versus how many are related to other incidents. So it's a helpful stat. Think about details about the user. Who is it that's generating this suspicious activity? What's their job title? Where do they work? When were they hired? Is it a particular shift, day shift, mids, night shift? Is there a known relationship between the user and the patient whose record was accessed inappropriately? If there are known relationships, those could signal behaviors that are occurring. So one thing that I noticed when I pulled this metric, I looked at relationships when I was implementing a similar program, and I found a trend of self-accesses, users who are going into their own record. So users going into their own record is telling me that people are, despite the fact that there was a policy that said you couldn't, they were either uninformed about that policy or they chose to, despite the policy, go in and violate that and look at their own information. We're going to talk a little bit more about that example later, but knowing that individuals are going into their own record is something I can learn from and respond to later. So this is where we're talking about documentation considerations are things that we can learn from and respond to later. And that ties all into step 4. That learning process of learning from our documentation is going to be the result of a little bit of research and trend analysis. And what are we performing that research on? The data that we have documented. So documentation ties right into trend analysis. So we're going to review our documentation over time to see if there are any patterns of behavior. When we're talking about patterns of behavior, we want to use those patterns to predict future incidents. We want to look at previous who, what, when, where, why, and how, so that we might predict future incidents or future occurrences. So when we're talking about the who, are we noticing that there are job titles, roles, age groups that are more prone to an incident? If I notice that my behavioral health department has had a lot of incidents last year, then that's going to tell me where to focus my energy. If I notice that individuals who are on night shift are generating the most inappropriate activity, I can learn from that. So the who is it? What parts of the chart are they going into? What data is accessed inappropriately? Now, this is one that I think can really benefit the way you audit in the future. So if you're learning from what behaviors your inappropriate actors are demonstrating, you can actually better audit for those behaviors in the future. If every time a user is snooping on a patient, they are looking at, let's say, historical patient summaries, so summaries from previous visits, then I'm going to know as an auditor that I need to keep an extra eye out for those summaries of previous visits, because that is a behavior of an individual who is snooping on old records. So visit histories might be something that I audit for. Printing and exporting events, if I see a lot of that in association with inappropriate activity, I'm going to track these. Now, we can also look at when these occur. What are the times that incidents occur? Now, for every organization, it could be a little bit different, but I noticed a trend in the night shift. When the normal daily operating procedures of my hospital group slowed down, we had idle hands. We had individuals with time on their hands and they got bored, and that boredom led them to hop on the EMR systems and just look around. And sometimes that looking around did result in breaches of privacy. So that when could be important. If it's my night shift that's giving me a problem, I need to find ways to keep them productive and occupied. Where are these incidents occurring? Is there a certain facility, department, workstation? The where is a valuable trend tracking element because it could be a computer that is in a private area. They know nobody's going to be looking over their shoulder. They know that this is an isolated workstation where they can sit and browse around all night with no one being any mindful to it. So the where can be important in that regard of where the actual device is, but it could also be a department. Maybe there's a department where the culture in that department is very loose. They go share information on family and friends regularly. While they're having these discussions, they'll go into the EMR systems. And to them, that's okay. It's a culture element in that group, amongst that peer group. So the where can be helpful in identifying cultural issues in certain locations in your facility. Why? The motive of the inappropriate actor. So why did that inappropriate activity occur? In my experience, I noticed that I had so many breaches that were truly meant with the best intentions. It was family members who were just checking up on a family member that they heard came into the emergency room. Or it was a dear friend who saw another friend's name in the news and they just wanted to see how they were doing. These are really meant with good intentions, but they're still a breach. So the motive can help you provide education that's sympathetic to that. It can help you know the kind of the mentality of the inappropriate actor and where they're going in the record. Another thing about the why is it's not always met with the best intentions. There are known information harvesting schemes that occur here. And information harvesting is where individuals will go into records with the intent of stealing protected health information or stealing private information to create fraudulent insurance accounts, to create fraudulent claims. There are things like leaking information to the news or local media on local celebrities and VIPs. Maybe if you have a politician, a professional athlete on your local college football team who got injured in a major televised sportscast, the media wants to know what happened, so individuals might take that information to sell it to the media. These things actually do happen. So understanding the motives behind the inappropriate actions that occur can be very helpful. And then finally, the how. The how is, what systems are they using? How did they do it? How did they create this breach? Did they use your EMR system? Did they use their own account? What path did they take through the record? We can actually better learn what to audit for by looking at the ways that inappropriate accesses occur. So this is a way that we can improve. And all of this learning, all of this prediction of future incidents ties to corrective action. Now, as we talk about corrective action, I want you to broaden what your vision is of corrective action. It's not just sanctions. Now, sanctions are a part of corrective action, but there is a bigger picture here. So, of course, we want to start with sanctions. When a breach occurs, what do you do about it? When a violation of your organization's policies occur, what should you do about it? And we need to make sure that we have an effective and consistent sanction policy, and that should be a priority in every organization. We need to know what we are going to do in response to these types of incidents so that we can be consistent and effective. Now, what effective means is that if we don't have appropriate sanctions, if it's just verbal counseling every time, maybe the message isn't getting through and we need harsher or stronger sanctions. If sanctions are too harsh, it could be resulting in losing staff who are experienced and dedicated staff. So we need to actually ease back and not terminate for every infraction. So you have to find that effective balance of sanctioning so that you are educating staff, you're sending the right message, you're providing opportunity for growth, but you're also establishing a foundation that we don't tolerate inappropriate behavior. We will respond to these incidents. They are not infractions that we won't take seriously. So that's building that effective sanction policy. But it goes beyond sanctions. We have to think about what improvements we can make in our organizations to prevent incidents in the future. All of those things we learned from in our documentation, those things about the who, what, when, where, why, and how, we took that learning and now let's apply it to prevent that breach from happening again. Now, I broke this into 3 categories. There are administrative changes that you can make in your organization. There are technical and there are physical, just like in the HIPAA guidelines. The administrative changes you can make is just good policies that you're effectively communicating to your organization. Now, let's go back to my self-access example. When users in my previous organization were going into their own record, we actually did some digging and we found that it was in a policy that was kind of buried under a number of other policies. You had to actually do some digging to find the rule that says you weren't allowed to go into your own record. And that was never effectively communicated in new hire orientation. It was never effectively communicated in our employee handbook. It was just written in a policy and tucked away into our archive. So when we hired new staff, and when we even had veteran staff who had been on for years, I started to ask around, hey, are you aware that you're not allowed to go into your own record? No, I had no idea. So I had a policy there, but it wasn't communicated effectively. So having a policy is only part of the battle. The rest of it is getting the word out of what those policies are and what they mean to your organization. And that can be done through things like training and awareness programs. I'm a huge advocate of constant training and awareness. Keeping the message out in your organization, keeping that privacy as a strategy, as a business strategy, privacy as a business initiative can be so helpful to just keep it at the forefront of people's minds. It is a decision support tool. When somebody is sitting in front of that computer and they're trying to decide, should I go into my own record, that awareness program might be the thing that they remember, that thing that they read in your newsletter, that email that got sent out on Monday, that encourages them to not violate that policy. So constant training and awareness. Identity and access management. This goes back to clearly defining what users are allowed to go into, who your users are, and then setting up their accounts appropriately. Just some administrative work up front can save you a lot of technical headaches down the road. So good housekeeping can definitely help prevent those breaches. Now let's look at technical safeguards. We want to make sure that accounts are configured with the least privilege necessary. And this is hard. In my previous organization, we had somewhere around 3,500 employees, and doing an audit to make sure after the fact that 3,500 people, and that's a mid-sized hospital system. There are hospital systems going up to 30, 50,000 employees easy. I could not imagine having to do an account audit to make sure that access is appropriate for that many individuals, but it absolutely can be done. You want to make sure that individuals have access to what they're supposed to. And even if that technical requirement seems daunting, it is something that organizations can do by starting with new hires, doing it in small batches. Maybe we're going to audit 10 or 20 at a time, but doing that least privilege necessary can absolutely be a positive change to make sure that people don't have access to things they're not supposed to. Role-based access controls are a good way to tie into that. And then we want to implement technology that is going to detect incidents of types that we've seen in the past. So I had mentioned that you can audit things like the volume of records that an individual is going into. You can audit when individuals go into family members, friends, and coworkers. Well, there are technology solutions out there that are built to do that for you and to alert you when it happens. So there is technology that can make this job easier. So if I know that the behaviors that I'm seeing are individuals who are going into their own record, or individuals who are going into family and friends, some technology can help to really catch that when it happens and help us respond more readily. Finally, physical safeguards. Let's say we go back to that example where a device was in a private location and night shift employees were kind of ghosting from their position, going over to that device and spending time on the internet or browsing through the EMR. Well, let's take that device or that workstation and let's move it into an area where that individual's activity can be observed by peers. Workstation and screen positioning. This is one, I used to do walkthrough audits. And as a result of walkthrough audits, I would see that sometimes the patient standing at the counter could read what was on the screen of other patients. So something as simple as positioning or adding a screen filter, it could be something you've learned through auditing and through documentation, and now we're applying the corrective action to fix that. We're going to fix it and prevent that from being an issue moving forward. But the process never stops. We're going to rinse and repeat. We're going to look at our policies, and our policies may not be effectively communicated. They may not be well written. Our procedures of how we're going to audit may need some refinement. So let's go back to the drawing board and let's update those policies based on what we've learned. And then let's take this through another round of auditing. Let's audit again and try to get better at it. Let's use those new technologies that we have purchased or acquired, or that we're refining and getting better at using, so that we are auditing more effectively. Then, as we document, now we're refining our documentation processes. Documentation is getting faster. We're getting better at it. We're recording more incidents as they occur. And then we're learning trend analysis. We're looking at patterns. We're learning from our data so that we can fix the areas where there are problems. So in my self-access example, we had a policy, we did, that said you weren't allowed to go into your own record. And I audited for access, and I found that it was still happening all the time. Individuals went into their own records quite frequently. So I documented those incidents, and we did have sanctions that we applied to sanction those individuals. So that was one of my forms of corrective action. And I learned about if my sanctions were effective, and I learned about if that policy was well communicated through trend analysis. And then I said, hey, what's the problem here? Well, I need to improve. So my corrective action involved modifying my sanctions policy, updating my awareness program to get the word out that self-access wasn't allowed. And then a neat thing about tracking those incidents and documenting them is I was able to go to my leadership and say, we have had an 85% reduction in self-access related incidents in the last 90 days. You actually, when you are documenting those incidents, you get meaningful metrics, and those meaningful metrics help to monitor. They help to keep the score in your organization, see where you are, and constantly improve. And as you're constantly improving, the message gets out. Those staff members that my awareness program was getting to, those staff members who had been notified of those sanctions, they were no longer going into their own record. A positive improvement in behavior, and as word got out, a positive improvement in culture began to emerge. So remember, it goes beyond just meeting the regulatory requirement. It's not just filling the checkbox, but it's tying all of these steps together to have a meaningful change in your organization. And that is the privacy cycle. I want to go ahead and open it up now to any questions with our last few minutes here. Estelle, do we have any questions to address?
Thanks, Tim. We actually had a few more attendees join the webinar since our last Q&A period, so I'd like to let them know that if you have a question, you can go ahead and type it into the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. And Tim, we do have a couple of interesting questions. Are EHRs required to have PHI audit logs?
Yes, they are. Now, does that mean that they do? Different EHR systems have met those compliance requirements in different ways. I can tell you that they are required by federal law to audit the access to that protected health information. But the way that the vendors have responded to that requirement, the way that they are meeting that guideline tends to differ from system to system. Some keep it in bolted on database. Some have a very intuitive and comprehensive audit logging solution. Some actually require you to purchase or to pay for a logging component that gets enabled within the system. So that can be different from a system to system basis. Now, this law does also apply to homegrown or in-house development EHR systems. So if you are using any sort of system with homegrown components, those do need to have a provision to audit access to protected health information.
Thanks, Tim. And in your experience, have you ever heard of hospitals disabling their audits, or have you ever run into a case where audit logs made the operational system too slow?
Yes and yes. So I have seen an instance where an organization had purge parameters that would basically not retain audit logs beyond a certain date. So they would basically say, hey, if it goes beyond 30 or 60 or 90 days, those audit logs are going to purge because we just don't have the storage space to hold it. Now, there's some terms that get thrown around like security by obscurity, and we don't have to report to OCR what we don't know. So there's some negligence, some willful negligence that I've seen go into those decisions, but I would never advocate it. It is my recommendation to always store audit logs to allow you to conduct a HIPAA audit back to at least 6 years. 6 years of audit logging capability in each system in which a breach could occur in your organization. Have I seen audit logging slow down a system? There have been solutions, some solutions that if they're mismanaged, implemented poorly, things like interfacing solutions, data archiving solutions, data warehousing solutions. So any type of solution that gets bolted onto your EMR, if it is not configured with your EMR's performance in mind, it can result in a degradation of performance. So auditing systems are absolutely susceptible to that as well. So that's where you have to consider things like your hardware specifications, where the audit logs are being stored in terms of data archiving, data vaults, and do you have just the right solution in place for your size and scope of your organization. A lot of factors that go into that, but my recommendation is always have the appropriate hardware and appropriate storage to maintain 6 years of comprehensive audit logs.
those are all the questions that we have at this time.
All right, if you have any other questions, feel free to submit them. I hope that during our presentation today, you were able to take away a few things. Few takeaways that I wanted everyone to have today was that there is a strategy that ties policies and procedures to an effective continuous process to improve your organization's culture. And that strategy is the privacy cycle. It's what we talked about today. I hope that you saw some tips for building a successful proactive auditing and documentation program. Think about the size and scope of your organization. Conduct a risk assessment. Consider the regulations or regulatory requirements, and consider the technology and experience. And hopefully these will help you refine your auditing program. And then when it comes to documentation, document those things that are going to be required, so that incident documentation, breach notification actions, and any decision support that came to identifying a breach. Make sure you're having a good comprehensive documentation program, and it's documentation that you can learn from. And then finally, I want everyone to take away an approach to routinely analyze your incidents for patterns. Look back at what you've learned over time. Look back at that documentation so that future incidents can be prevented through realistic corrective action measures. And sometimes even your corrective action, like the sanctions in your organization, need to be addressed to meet the needs of your organization. So I hope that you're able to take those things away. And now I want to thank everyone for joining us today as I turn it back over to Estelle to wrap us up and talk about our survey.
Tim, thanks so much for a really informative presentation. We did get one final comment that said, thank you very much. I found this very useful and it was refreshing. So thanks again, as always, for a great presentation. And as Tim mentioned, we'd like to thank all of you who took the time to join us today. As a reminder, you'll have an opportunity to fill out a short survey to tell us how we did. That survey is going to appear in your browser when you exit the webinar. And after you submit your answers, your name will be entered into a drawing to win a $100 Amazon gift card. And all drawings are held at the end of each month. If you'd like information about our patient privacy solutions, please contact your iAtric Systems account executive, or if you don't know who that is, you can send us an email at info@iatric.com. I hope everybody has a great day, and this concludes our webinar.